Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 29. The year 159 saw dampened spirits meet the desert heat of old Persia, where ancient cities and fortresses had preserved warlords since the fall of the Golden Age, and the omnipresent mountains spoke of the wars that had occurred at the end of those times. Now, war arrived again, for the first time fought by people who knew whence the mountains had come. There is a city in the deserts of eastern Persia called Yadst, which thought itself protected by mountains on one side and the border guards on the other. Those guards, though, had been diminished through a decade of skirmishing with the Bactrians, which the Bosporans funded and encouraged eagerly, and the mountains, for their part, were insufficient to prevent witness Aeneas passing through at the break of spring. It is said he knew the best routes instinctively, and I suspect he was recalling paragonic memories of the late Ampelios to achieve this, not that he dared boast of any such ability. Having achieved surprise, Aeneas came up to the walls as if there was no conquering army at his back, and requested that his men be allowed to encamp beside the city and draw provisions from it. Representatives of the local governorship came and contested this puzzling request, showing confidence and inviting battle and siege to settle the matter. Aeneas said, "You have not seen enough? Then another slaughter you will have. This will only plant seeds of malice for centuries to come, you know. But you know best." The envoys believed this message was addressed to them, and recorded it with a sense of injustice, but I think Aeneas may have been speaking to the whole world. Next, he ordered his army to attack the city walls with no prior readying of means, relying on 2 short ladders and small ramming blocks to gain entry. Since the city's levy was not yet armed, this was possible, and by luck, there was a part of the wall that was in such a state of disrepair that it collapsed not by weight of ram, but by the gentle lean of ladder alone. The city was overrun in a shocking fashion, and the governorship was made to submit even before they had finished walking back to their office after the first meeting. Such was the sudden fall of Yadst, and again King Jairus knew not how injured his cause was becoming by these things. At the same time, the main army had been risen in Mesopotamia, beginning the full-fledged campaign to subdue Persia, led by the king himself. Having stormed and taken the ancient city of Susa, the king then split the army into 2 parts. The first part he took into the mountains to seek the holy city of Istaka, said to host a dedicated Seleucid garrison. The second part, in which only a few Lithosis were to be found, went with Darius and Dion along the coast from Charax until they reached the next major port, called Sirath. I think there is equal parts strategy and grievance to be found in this dual strike, for on the one hand it made a Seleucid response harder to concentrate, there was none in either case in fact, and on the other hand it allowed father and son to be apart and not have to face each other's stubborn visions for a better world. I suspect these things weighed heavily upon Pairisades, and motivated him to capture Persia's holy sites all the more. Sirath was not hard to capture because the whole garrison had been moved to Aravia. Almost any person who lived there could testify that Jairus had come here after his release from Bosporan captivity, and made away with his ships and treasury. Only recently had the upheaval of this been remedied, and so Darius saw fit to treat the people lightly, enacting no changes to the law and leaving only a few soldiers as a symbolic garrison over a city that perhaps felt they were being let alone with their independence. The army rested in the city for a month before departing, following Dion's vanguard, which had set off 10 days prior, with the aim of securing nominal allegiance from all the coastal regions of Persia. For the most part, these places were well aware that they had been abandoned by their ruler, and took little convincing to risk the wrath of his hypothetical return to gain safety from the armies they saw with their own eyes. Armies whose cosmopolitan makeup implied the breadth of the territory they commanded already, and it follows the madness of opposing whatever cause commanded them. Likewise, Pairisades found that taking Istaka was as simple a thing as inviting collaborators to profit from his arrival. The gates were open when his riders came up the road in column, and the violence inside the city was more akin to a spree of criminal acts than a true battle. Therefore, after very slowly approaching the city and carefully scouting its surrounds, it fell in a span of 1 or 2 days. Such was the ease of taking great cities in a land ruined by useless kings, while not being permitted to produce kings of their own. Istaka had a rich temple district in which deities from a wide stroke of the earth were all honoured, and it was a place where people who did not usually worship gods they were not familiar with were exposed to different aspects of the cosmic caste. The king established a sort of encampment in the largest agora in the district, decorated with the many fine materials the Persian artisans produced, and then layered again with surprisingly unique fineries that caravans brought from places so distant that there is no use me telling you the names, for there is no map that I know of that even mentions such obscure frontiers. In this camp he prepared a proper sacrifice site, insisting on doing the labour of this himself. As his vast gang of ancillaries watched, he made sacrifice of a white bull, then a black, and finally he looked like he was going to spill his own blood onto the altar as well. Instead, he cut an incision across his left bicep and placed it to his mouth, drinking his own blood in the image of the Ouroboros. Then he said, "Amid all the airs of the world have I lived. Every point in the sky has seen my face. You await my coming with eagerness, gods, for your entertainment is always at hand. Like a man who gnaws his fingers with inalienable glee and feels happiness the critical onlookers are not equipped to know. You are certain humankind cannot overcome its woes, and that I am going to prove it to you. I have been certain of that for some time now too. But I know that you and I are both weak, not strong, so why have faith in either? You cannot destroy this world, and I cannot destroy yours. Nay, it would take humans to destroy this world, and that is why we are your hammer and chisel, because you would make our world the endless torment of the mind that yours always is. I feel your pain. I sense the horror of immortality, powerless immortality, and the anger you felt when Manos found how it needn't be so for all. You said to yourself, there was another way, then all my suffering so far was for nothing. And you cursed not yourself then, but the innovator who sees how your state could be bettered, and you become not better but worse. That is what you're doing to us, gods. That is what I truly believe. And I believe in the ancient words that you foolishly let me know, in the truth of what the world was made for. It is possible indeed, and it shall happen again once we are rid of the likes of you, and before that, once we are rid of the likes of me. All this madness will end for me, and my people will make sure that you never need look upon us in drowning vitriol, free from all doubt. The Golden Age, we will find how it was done, again." After this, the king was dragged away by a crowd of Lithosis wrapped in white sheets. Some witnesses say he was unconscious, others that he was overcome by a fit of tears. Either way, there is no doubt that the king had found a victorious place in his heart. It always brings me joy to tell people about this, because in the story of humanity's uplifting, the king was the primary instigator and among the foremost crusaders, and we have been experiencing his many exploits throughout this entire work. Therefore, it is nice to think that he was able to overcome the losses this story inflicted upon him in his final days, and that, sadly, is what I must record next. This punctuating moment in history was to take place not in Istaka, but in neighbouring Conan, another of Persia's interior cities. After selecting this place as his ultimate destination, Pairisades wrote many letters and important documents for distribution all across the world. Most importantly, he had word sent to the Persian coast to seek out his son and inform the heir of the ruler's plan. Once all was accounted for, Istaka was quit by the whole Bosporan force, but for a mere 100 men, under Arcadios, a close companion of the king, for he was the son of the late witness Diotrephes. The king arrived at Khaman at the height of summer, and quickly took the prearranged surrender of the leading men, whose wisdom was sufficient to break their allegiance to Jairus now that he had been absent and negligent for all his years as ruler. Khaman was sister city to Istaka because the regulations preventing impure activities in the holy city allowed Khaman to provide these things doubly. One should not expect that by deeming an activity unsuitable for good people will not seek it out all the same. This is especially true in Persia, Egypt, or any place with old-fashioned peoples. As such, Khaman had an oversized racing track, with many ranks of stands for spectators, a stone perimeter, and tall towers with commanding views of its elongated course. This location had caught the king's attention, because it was large enough to assemble the whole Luthosis army and still have room for the horses to cycle around the track, like fish circling a pond. Likewise, the people of the region were squeezed in too, eager to see the strange forest folk widely rumoured to be harbingers of the world's end. Their richly tattooed appearance, which was considered outrageous in Persia, did not scare off those who wished to stare at the herds of stout horses in the hippodrome, even less so those who wished to provoke horse races and place money on their favourites. This was precisely the sort of thing EUSPQR purists denounced. Here there was an impromptu festival for several days, while Pairisades waited for Darius to arrive from Hermosia. The prince was in turn delayed by the need to double back along the coast and fetch his own son, Elpenor, who had been coming to join Darius at a leisurely pace since completing his education the previous year. The young lad was struck by the urgency of the premature reunion with his father, but could not have known how much he would suddenly be burdened with as a result. Once the pair were in Conan, along with many Persian notables fished out of their cautious holes by the sheer curiosity of the pageant, Pairisades performed sacrifices before the whole army and a huge crowd. Many speakers trained to the same script were placed along the stands and made to recite a long sermon of ancient wisdom, translated immediately into Persian and Luthosis tongues, then further on to minor languages. Hundreds were present in this city of sin. Then Darius was summoned to stand beside the king and receive the turquoise cloak of command, which had adventured with Pairisades so far and wide. Even onlookers who didn't completely understand the sermons were transfixed by the significance of what they were seeing. The king pulled his golden cap down over his face and turned away from his son, and 3 attendants pushed said son to address the crowd. "I am not king to you because my sword is unbroken and my banner intact. I am king because I take the whole world to be my family, and I shall lay down my life before any of yours," Darius decreed. He had prepared more, yet could not bear to say anything else, since he could hear Pairisades weeping behind him. The onlookers were moved to tears themselves, and the Luthosis sang loud and sonorous prayers that mixed sorrow with synchronicity. This heightened the effect on the natives, whose latent memories of their ancient roots were pried open by these Golden Age verses. It should also be noted that it was a rare thing for anyone to witness the abdication of a king, and Darius recalls that as the point he was most proud for this ceremony to have made. There was then an expensively provisioned funerary ceremony, especially lavish when one considers that the man in question was still alive, but it was a symbolic gesture to impress upon one the notion that the man known as King and the man known as Pairisades III Spartakid were different compartments in the grand order of the world. King is as much a verb as it is a noun, the way the Luthosis understood it, and so it was that a king's funeral was held before a throbbing crowd, and it was treated as a celebration of virtue rather than a dirge of an untethered soul. And it was not entirely cynical either, because both Darius and Pairisades came to the agreement that state business would be conducted as if the man, Pairisades, now had died also. This way, instead of being pinned with any overhanging obligations, Pairisades could take a journey to the far north with some trusted men of his Luthosis clique, and be among the earth wrought by our ancestors in the First Lands. Once this was agreed upon among the family, it was done with no fanfare or ceremony at all. Darius saw his father off on the understanding that he was, for all intents and purposes, dead, and the 62-year-old rough-hewn looking man he watched ride away was somebody entirely different. If one sees the world in a certain way, this idea is not very strange at all. I will also add here, since the students at my shoulder insist on asking, that there are indeed no other records of Pairisades after this time. The Luthosis are given the courtesy of keeping what secrets they wish, and for all people have done to try and discover what legends must have arisen in the World's End forest, there is nothing of credence worth our attention. The first decision Darius made as king was the one that is always said to be his worst, most unkingly, and downright treacherous if some more radical views are to be entertained. He ordered the whole army at Conan to depart east and tackle the matter of subduing the Seleucid borders with Bactria, where war remained a daily burden. But the point of contention was that he sent his son, Elpenor, to be the general of this army, despite the boy being too young and utterly untrained for warfare. He was also sickly, and understood the past so much more than the present that he was like a wraith from ancient times. Such are the complaints usually raised. In defense of this move, I will note that Elpenor had extremely good command of the Lithosis language, speaking it more fluently than Greek, and furthermore the army in question had so many of its own veteran commanders to rely upon that attaching a prince to the camp was perhaps just a formality to assure the men that the Empire was still sponsoring and supporting their endeavours. Remember, the Lithosis conquered because they wished it for themselves and the world, more so than because they were serving a family of liege lords. The ending of the affair at Conan, then, was that all visitors went their ways, and it wasn't even clear if the Bosporans had conquered the city or not. This encouraged a lot of rebellious activity from the many warbands run by private merchants and landowners, and so this disregard for stately matters was an additional weakness we must now tie to the new king. These matters were left aside for the time being because Darius was more interested in pursuing Dion, knowing he had taken his men even further down the Persian coast with a single goal: wipe the Seleukids away up to whatever would admit to being their border, such that the conquest of the sea was as rich and whole as the law would allow. This he had achieved with characteristic vigour, having taken the grand city of Pura, a fortress among cities that had long marked the edge of Hellenic civilization. We obviously know that civilization exists further on into Indiki, and I have no doubt that Dion was as drawn to visit it as his personal paragon Alexander was. Yet Darius was quick at hand to bring such dreams down into the bloody dirt, for there was nothing about Persia now that was akin to Persia of Alexandrian times, in that the people had been ruled by Greeks for centuries now, and learned that this state of subjugation was not what the original conquerors had promised hundreds of years prior. Such people were cognizant of the brief interlude in which Jairus' grip was torn away, and the Bosporans were disparate and seemingly unsure of which offices should hold what powers in the early days of the new reign. There were endless rich men without power and desperate men without means of self-rule, whose union made rebellion a natural course of a disordered people. This then was the greatest obstacle to conquering the Seleukids, not the men of Jairus, but those of 1,000 landlords, cult channelers, and self-proclaimed nobles who exploited their familiarity with the land to form considerable armies in close proximity to the field armies of the huge new empire forming around them. While none posed significant threat, this is always easy to say in retrospect, their action kept military business at the forefront, and in turn lessened the ability of the new governors to uplift correctly. There is a saying in Egypt that people would rather die by their own design than live happily by the ways others show them. I think this is a natural quality of people, because in the Golden Age, to divert from what you felt was right would have been a terrible error. Now that our feelings are compromised by cosmic winds and material illnesses, I should think the wisdom has been entirely reversed. Because of all this, Dion and Darius both agreed to amiable treaties with the local Indiki kings when offered, so that they could retrace their steps and push down a greater impression of Bosporan virtue upon Persia. The awakening of 157 did not only affect Persians or defeated Seleucid pretenders. The shock of the unusual way in which Darius had taken power at first made it difficult for the usual sniffing about of power brokers looking to organise profitable trouble among high political offices. After a few months had passed, there were some who could not bear to let go the chance to voice their concerns and ambitions together under banners of war. Many small events are known to have occurred, so I will tell you only the most important one: the usurping of Salukia itself by a conspiracy of a man once trusted by Pairisades, Apollodorus of Pantikapaeum, the same fondly featured man who was called Apollodorus of Tanais in the camp diaries of Diotrephes, as few ever realise. He had conspired with Abalnu, who in turn had conspired with Jairus, and all together they declared a fresh war in 157, and that Mesopotamia should recognise no change in their rightful ruler. In this way, Abalnu broke his treaty with Darius and marched troops from the mountains with speed that revealed how ready they had made themselves for this dishonour. Apollodorus declared for Jairus, and because he had been tasked with overseeing Salukia, it was easy for him to bring local soldiers to his side and revert the city's status overnight. Apollodorus gives us clear example of his folly in the sequence of events that befell his enterprise hence. After controlling the city for a few months, he attempted to parley with the Pergamese to join his cause, on condition that they recognize him as king of Salukia. Instead, they accepted his invitation into the city and then promptly killed he and many of his supporters. The relevant heads were delivered eastwards so that King Darius could be satisfied that order was restored. In return, he permitted the Pergamese to control Salukia, an extremely generous move that is widely viewed as desperation for good leadership, or perhaps in the spirit of the Golden Age, Darius really did not mind giving another royal family ownership of such an important city that he had spent so much to acquire for his own kin. Kin is a notion that arose after the Golden Age, after all, if it did not in fact drive the very fall. This Pergamese administration was promptly replaced by a rebellious faction in the pocket of King Abalnu, and the drama ended in the autumn of the next year, 156, when Alcestis came with a small force and found the city was like an insect flailing on its back. He restored things to how they had been the previous year, and Bosporan law quickly righted the city's course. Such was the injury Apollodorus inflicted upon the world, and no one, especially not he, benefited from it at all. Returning to the summer of 157, this is when the Bosporan armies ventured into the cooler lands of Bactria, where the Seleukids still had armies at war. The Bactrians had suffered many defeats, and their prized city of Alexandria Prophthesia had been reclaimed by Seleukid loyalists, after being taken by the Bactrians 6 years prior. The Bosporan army slowly moved on this city from behind, moving very cautiously because none of the local people gave accurate reports about where the Seleukid armies were. They were, we now know, practicing banditry in northern Bactria, having gone without orders and pay for long enough to revert to a feral state of soldiery not suited to warfare. In the wake of their decay, the Bosporans crept forward, knowing not how easy their task would be. However, the caution was still warranted on account of the uneasy relationship between the Lithosis troops and Elpenor, who was not a leader of men by any honest account, apart from the fact that people who saw him said that he was a leader, and that is often all unsuitable men from royal lines have to rely upon. He, being aware of his own weakness and unable to qualify any cure, was driven further into sickness by stress. Even his horse, it is said, grew tired of his moaning. Then again, he was scarcely a grown man, and had grown slowly because of the many luxuries and fair consideration of his Lithosis teachers. So let us not damn him now before I have had the chance to put his life to you more fully. Before Elpenor and company achieved anything noteworthy, an event transpired that many Seleukids must have given up hope for. Their king, Jairus, emerged from hiding, and the manner of his return to politics and military business could be said to be the most comical thing a student of history will ponder, so let me spare you its details no longer. This affair took place in the autumn of 157 prior, and the stage was the aforementioned port city of Sirath, from hence Jairus had fled previously. His inglorious return was made in a fleet 1/10 the size of that which departed, because so much had been wrecked at sea in recent years, or sold to fickle and thin allies come enemies on the Arabian coast. The fleet approached the port, but upon witnessing the townspeople rushing to their boats to defend themselves, Jairus bade his flotilla to shore elsewhere. The Seraphians went out all the same in 4 light craft, and harried the flagship that Jairus had been on almost as soon as he rowed away in a small boat. This was because Jairus had been so cautious in staying behind the rest of his ships that he was left alone while the landings were taking place. We know that the leading naval officers of the fleet had all been transferred to this single ship to oversee a would-be blockade of the port once the troops were ashore. Instead, all were lost to the warm ocean, and the transport ships soon realized that something was amiss. They took to the wind and flew off east, leaving the army screaming with open-jawed rage at how it seemed only 4 small boats had scattered their 30 ships without a fight. To their relief, the city walls were not defended. After all, the men who had been tasked with defending them were those same ones now returning from a wasted venture to attack their home. And yet there was little gratitude or anticipation among the townspeople. The same spirit that pushed out those ships to harry the lost officers had kept people up all of the night prior, and in that time they had fortified their agora and stored many valuable and useful things there. Hence the Seleucid men, who were desperate for pay, could not gain much relief from a violent spree in the city. No, they would have to overcome their former comrades, and that was so distasteful that even the desire for coin or conquest was shaded. This cannot be said for King Jairus, of course, who ordered that an assault on the barricades be made. When this proved hard to organize, he went himself. A bold move, some say, if only a desperate one in reality. It is hard for soldiers to say that they have grievances with their commander if said commander is so openly performing brave and valorous acts. Hence an attack was made, and the people of Siraf, bolstered with a handful of Bosporan soldiers, made a stand on the basis of their own grievances with Jairus. I hope you already understand that such maddening and wasteful situations are the direct result of ill-mannered kings of his image. There was reason behind Jairus' bravery this day, when normally he would have waited far away for the danger to be resolved. This is explained by what supposedly happened next. Amid the fighting between the two sides, Jairus came to the front and appealed to the people to lay down their arms and resume their place in his domain. Some of the people said that they would rather negotiate than fight, and welcomed the king to come sit with them. Filled with illusions about the love these people held for him, Jairus went through their lines with only a few bodyguards. These guards, some claim, were killed and dragged away without Jairus noticing. Only after he sat did he take in the scene. Then did he realize his guards were gone, and he was instead surrounded by those people whose families he had plundered for manpower and whose wealth had been ferried to Arabian kings in exchange for naught but the very disruption his return created. Still, he believed that their distrust in him would be reversed with words. Instead, he was set upon in a most undignified manner by furious people. Even elders joined the scrum. The goal, I surmise, was that the king be stripped of his fine armor and clothing. This had military use. It was shown to his men at the barricade, who now realized their master was no longer at their backs, and hence withdrawing was a simple task. As for Jairus, he was subjected to a large number of theatrical humiliations because the people realized that this fallen king recognized no dignity worth keeping above his own head. It is said he was made to perform local dances, made to converse with statues as if they were real, and was asked to preside over a mock courtroom in which a dispute between chickens was arbitrated with absolute seriousness, with Jairus beaten if he failed to address these questionable clients with the customary deference. I think this would be less amusing if the townspeople did not ultimately keep their word. Yet they did, and true to their claims, the reward for completing an evening's entertainment was freedom. Jairus was let go from the town in mere pauper's clothes. He went to find his army. However, that night the army was in full retreat in all directions and was difficult to locate. The reason for this scattering was the arrival of military patrols from the Bosporan allied armies, namely the Pergamese, who had assisted across the region extensively. They intercepted many groups of soldiers and took them prisoner, or sometimes killed them. This, most agree, is the corner of history Jairus disappeared off to, because never is mention of his being alive found after this. And I am sure that he was killed rather than enslaved or exiled, since a man like him would not go through such a trial quietly. I suspect he was killed by soldiers who knew not who they had come upon, and felt unsatisfied with his boasts and claims to fame upon interrogation. I think we could say more, yet I think it is fitting that a man whose life took up so much of the world's attention already suffered a completely silent and pitiful demise, without master, servant, or ally to mark the occasion. It took over a year for wide belief in Jairus' death to spread through those below him in the state apparatus, because it had become standard practice for those officials to not hear anything from the king for long periods. This practice usually means one of two things. Everyday life is being managed without the need to appeal to higher ranks for justice, such as in the case of the late Pairisades, all that delivery of justice is not the concern of the state, as in the case of Jairus. Even though the people of Persia had to put up with war and the excesses of foreign soldiery, the coming of justice and truth was both a material and spiritual windfall that, I contend, demands gratitude from the living and forgiveness from the dead. Coming to appreciate this in the deepest recesses of our hearts is a challenge that all of us, once alien to truth, must approach with enthusiasm in our lives. I find that knowing our history aids in this task, as you might have guessed from my chosen vocation, and if you are in agreement, I invite you to read on and see how this war was formally ended, and the interim period of peace that came to grace the whole empire. Be warned, of course, that a return to sour and sacrilegious topics will be my course, for that is the truth our forebears lived through for our benefit. Thus I shall write of it unerringly, for the sake of living and dead alike.